The crew of the Titan-class ship, the Horizon, was still in the early stages of their mission. Drifting through the uncharted region of space, they were on a simple exploration mission. Nothing too extraordinary, or so they thought. The vastness of the cosmos stretched out endlessly before them, quiet and peaceful, with no sign of life for millions of light years. But deep inside the ship, in the heart of the command center, something strange was happening. Captain Morgan stood at the front, staring at the stars beyond the bridge windows. The ship's engines hummed steadily beneath his feet, the familiar sound almost soothing. The rest of the crew carried on with their tasks, checking systems and keeping track of their course. But something was off. There was a subtle tension in the air, a feeling that something was waiting for them just out of sight. Suddenly, the calm silence was broken by a sharp beep from the communications console. Lieutenant Carter, seated at the helm, looked up from his console with a frown. "Captain," Carter's voice was low, filled with a hint of unease. "We're picking up a signal. It's faint, but it's definitely there." Morgan's gaze snapped to Carter. He knew the lieutenant didn't usually react to minor glitches, so this was something more. "What kind of signal?" Morgan asked, stepping closer to the console. "It's unusual, sir," Carter replied, his fingers tapping rapidly at the controls. The screen flickered for a moment before stabilizing, showing a series of complex waveforms. "It's not like anything we've encountered before. No pattern we recognize. Could be some kind of transmission, but the frequency, it's unlike anything we've seen." Morgan's heart rate picked up. A signal out here, in the middle of nowhere. There had been no sign of life in this sector. They were far beyond any known space routes, and the last time humanity had made contact with aliens was still a distant memory. And yet, here was something unmistakably artificial. "Can we trace it?" Morgan asked, a growing sense of urgency creeping into his voice. Carter nodded. "I'm trying, sir. It's difficult. The signal seems to be bouncing off something, maybe a dense object or some kind of interference in the region. I can't pinpoint its exact location." "Bring up all scans of the area," Morgan ordered. He turned to his crew. "Prepare for anything. This could be our first contact." As the scans populated on the screen, the crew stared at the data. There were no visible signs of objects, no ships, no space stations, no planets, just the endless, empty void. But then, Carter zoomed in on a small anomaly, a faint flicker of light coming from what appeared to be an asteroid belt, far off in the distance. It was small, barely noticeable, and seemed to pulse with irregular intervals. "The signal, it's coming from there," Carter said, his voice almost in disbelief. Morgan stared at the anomaly. "How far?" "About 12 light-years away," Carter replied. "That's far. But it's strange. This could be a natural source, but there's something about it. I've never seen anything like it." The captain frowned, a cold shiver running down his spine. The distance was vast, yet something about the signal felt important. Something was out there, hidden in the depths of space, waiting for them. "Plot a course," Morgan said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "We'll investigate." Lieutenant Carter nodded, his fingers flying over the controls. "Course set, Captain. It'll take us a few hours to reach the source." Morgan turned to the rest of the bridge crew. "I want eyes on every system. If this is something we don't understand, we need to be ready." The crew moved quickly, adjusting their positions and running checks on the ship's defenses, ensuring all systems were operational. The atmosphere in the command center grew tense as they closed in on the source of the mysterious signal. As the Horizon glided through space, the ship's engines humming smoothly, the crew remained focused, but a creeping sense of something larger was unfolding. They were on the brink of something unknown, something neither they nor their technology could comprehend. The signal continued to pulse, its pattern erratic, sometimes faint, sometimes louder, but always there. It felt almost alive, like it was waiting for them to come closer. The silence of space around them seemed to heighten the tension. The ship was flying toward an invisible force, something that could change everything. Yet it was the uncertainty of the signal itself that made the situation feel even more dangerous. And then, the quiet of the journey was shattered. A deep hum filled the ship, vibrating through the very walls of the horizon. It wasn't a sound from the ship's engines. This was something else. Something external. "Captain, we've lost control of the ship," Carter shouted, panic rising in his voice. "The signal. It's affecting the navigation system." Morgan quickly moved to his station, pulling up the controls. The ship's systems were glitching. He could feel the pull of something, some invisible force, that seemed to guide them. It was as though the signal was reaching out, tugging at the ship itself. "We're being drawn toward it," Carter said, trying to regain control, but the ship was moving of its own accord, faster now, heading toward the heart of the anomaly. "Shut down all non-essential systems," Morgan barked. "We need to regain control before it's too late." But it was no use. The force, whatever it was growing stronger, the ship pulling toward something in the distance. Through the windows, Morgan could see a faint glow in the far distance, getting brighter, closer. And then, as they neared the source of the signal, the glow intensified, revealing an enormous circular structure, a massive, ancient-looking station, completely silent, floating in space. It was beyond anything humanity had ever encountered, a vast relic of some long-lost civilization. The signal wasn't just a message. It was a beacon calling to them. But from what? Who had left it? The crew was now on the brink of discovery, but the question remained. Were they walking into a trap, or had they just stumbled upon the greatest discovery in human history? The ship's systems finally sputtered back to life, and Morgan knew they had no choice but to approach. They were too close now to turn back. With a deep breath, he made the only decision he could. "Full stop," he commanded. "Prepare for first contact." But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something much larger, much darker than they could ever have imagined. Something alien, and perhaps far more dangerous than they were ready for. As the ship slowly closed in on the station, the crew braced themselves for whatever would come next. The first contact had begun. The horizon drifted toward the colossal station, its massive silhouette now clearly visible against the backdrop of space. Every crew member on board felt a mix of awe and dread. No one had ever encountered anything like this. The station was ancient, its surface covered in strange, unrecognizable symbols, with jagged lines that seemed to pulse and shift with a life of their own. The glow from the station intensified, casting eerie shadows over the horizon as it inched closer. Captain Morgan stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the mysterious structure. His mind raced. What was this place? Who built it? And why was the signal leading them here? The tension on the bridge was palpable, every crew member holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The eerie silence from the station seemed to press in on them, heavy and suffocating. "We're approaching the docking port," Carter said, his voice tight with apprehension. His hands moved over the controls, trying to guide the ship to a safe landing spot. The horizon's systems were still twitchy, as if something was interfering with the ship's controls. They were at the mercy of the unknown, and it was becoming harder to ignore the growing sense that they were being drawn in, not just by the signal, but by something far more dangerous. As they drew closer to the station, the ship's automated systems beeped and chirped with alerts. The external cameras displayed the strange, spidery lines on the station's surface, and now that they were closer, they could see that there were no signs of life. No movement, no ships docked, not even a single flicker of light from within. It was as if the entire structure was waiting, or perhaps watching them. Morgan's hand hovered over the communication panel. He was about to hail the station when the entire ship shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered, and alarms blared throughout the ship. The crew scrambled to their stations as Carter fought with the controls, desperately trying to steady the ship. "Captain, we're losing control," Carter shouted, his voice laced with panic. "Something's pulling us in." Before Morgan could respond, the ship lurched again. This time, it wasn't just a shake. The horizon seemed to be magnetically drawn toward the station. The force was powerful, almost as if the station itself were alive, with the ability to manipulate the ship's movements. "Shut down the engines," Morgan barked. "Override all controls." But it was too late. The horizon was already inside the docking bay, the ship's momentum carrying them toward an open, darkened entrance. The bay doors began to close automatically behind them, sealing them inside. The station was swallowing them whole. The crew held their breath as the ship came to a slow stop. Outside, the station loomed, its surface covered with intricate, glowing patterns. The docking bay was vast, empty, and silent. Far too quiet. Morgan's eyes scanned the area, and for a moment, he felt as though they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer in known space. They had entered something else, something ancient, forgotten, and possibly dangerous. After a tense moment, the lights inside the docking bay flickered on, revealing the interior of the station. It was eerily clean, sterile even, with smooth metallic walls and towering structures that stretched high above them. The air was still, untouched by time. It felt like no one had set foot here in centuries, if not longer. "Captain, we've landed," Carter said, his voice strained but composed. "We're in." Morgan nodded slowly. "All right, prepare to board. All crew members are to remain on high alert. We don't know what we're dealing with here." The crew began to prepare for an unknown kind of first contact. They gathered their equipment, weapons, and communication devices. There were no guarantees that they'd be able to communicate with whatever, or whoever, had sent the signal. Morgan's heart pounded as he pulled on his jacket and stepped toward the airlock. The silence in the bay was overwhelming, but there was something about it that felt almost unnatural. The crew had crossed into a place where time seemed to stand still. As the airlock hissed open, the crew stepped out, weapons drawn, their boots echoing against the metallic floor. The station felt abandoned, but there was an unnerving feeling that they were being watched. The walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols that pulsed intermittently, but there was no sign of any alien life forms. Lieutenant Carter, ever the cautious one, took the lead. "We should be careful," he warned, his voice low. "This place, it's like it's alive. It's watching us." Morgan nodded, eyes scanning the surrounding space. "I know. Just keep your wits about you. We don't know what kind of danger we're walking into." They walked cautiously down the darkened hallway, the sound of their footsteps the only noise that filled the air. The walls around them were smooth, but the deeper they went into the station, the more the symbols seemed to shift and change. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, reacting to their presence. The crew moved in a tight formation, every step measured and deliberate. It didn't take long for them to reach a large central chamber. The size of the room was staggering. It seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, the ceiling so high it was impossible to see where it ended. In the center of the room stood something that stopped them all in their tracks, a massive, intricate obelisk. It was made of black stone, covered in the same glowing symbols that adorned the station's walls. The obelisk stood alone, emanating an eerie light that filled the chamber with a soft glow. Lieutenant Carter stepped forward, his fingers itching to examine the strange artifact. "This is definitely alien. But what is it? What purpose does it serve?" Before anyone could answer, the lights in the chamber suddenly flickered, then went dark. The hum that had been present earlier intensified, vibrating through the walls. And then, a voice. It wasn't audible. It was inside their heads, like a whisper that traveled directly to their minds. "You have arrived." The voice was calm, but carried a chilling weight. The crew froze, their breath caught in their throats. "You are not alone. You have entered our domain. The voice echoed in their minds again, stronger this time, as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We are watching. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. The crew was no longer sure if they were alone. They were being judged, whether they realized it or not. Morgan's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but the voice echoed again, a warning that froze him in place. Do not draw your weapons. They stood there in the dark, waiting, the pulse of the station echoing around them, as the weight of the unknown pressed down upon them. Something ancient, something powerful, was here, and they had just stepped into its domain. The test had begun, and they had no idea what they would face next. The silence that followed the voice was suffocating. The crew stood frozen in the center of the dark chamber, their breaths shallow, their minds racing. Captain Morgan's hand remained firmly on the grip of his sidearm, though his instincts told him to hold off. The alien presence, whatever it was, had just spoken directly into their minds, and that was more than enough to make every nerve on edge. We should respond, Lieutenant Carter finally whispered, his voice tense but steady. We can't just stand here, waiting. Morgan hesitated, glancing around at the rest of the crew. His eyes met the fearful yet determined looks of his officers. They all wanted answers. Answers to the signal, to the station, and to the voice that had just echoed in their minds. But there was an uncertainty in the air, an overwhelming sense that they were stepping into something far beyond their understanding. Let's stay calm, Morgan ordered, his voice low but authoritative. We don't know what we're dealing with yet, but we're not going to make any decisions without knowing more. Carter, try to scan for any other signals. Something's here, and we need to understand it. Carter nodded, pulling out his handheld scanner and starting to move along the edges of the chamber, scanning for any unusual energy signatures. His fingers moved quickly over the device, but the more he tried to measure, the more the readings became distorted, as if the station itself was playing tricks with their instruments. We're not getting clear data, Carter reported, his frustration growing. It's like everything's been cloaked, hidden. The signals are being suppressed somehow. I can't make sense of it. Meanwhile, Dr. Harris, the ship's lead scientist, approached the obelisk in the center of the room. His eyes were filled with fascination, yet caution. He reached out a hand, but hesitated just before touching the surface. There's a strange energy emanating from this object, he muttered under his breath. It's almost alive. Morgan's eyes locked on Dr. Harris. Do you think it's some kind of communication device? I'm not sure, Harris replied, his voice full of wonder. But if it is, it's sending out more than just signals. It feels like it's watching us. A chill ran down Morgan's spine at those words. They had already been warned, told they were being watched. But the sense of being scrutinized intensified. It was as if the entire station was aware of every move they made, every breath they took. Captain, we're not alone in here, Lieutenant Carter said, his voice tight with tension. He was still scanning the chamber, his eyes darting nervously around. The signal, it's changing. It's not just passive anymore. It's reacting to us. Morgan turned sharply to Carter. What do you mean, reacting? Before Carter could respond, a low hum began to vibrate through the air, growing louder with each passing second. The obelisk in the center of the room began to glow brighter, casting long shadows across the chamber. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the increasing hum. Then the voice returned. This time, it was stronger, deeper, more commanding. You have crossed into our domain. The voice echoed, a cold, heavy presence in their minds. We are the Onyx. You are not welcome here. The crew's hearts sank at the mention of the name, the Onyx. They had never heard of such a race, at least not in any known records. The Onyx were ancient, powerful, and the mention of their name struck fear into every one of them. Something about the name felt wrong, as though they were intruding on a realm that was never meant to be disturbed. Leave now, or face the consequences. The warning was clear. There was no mistaking it. The Onyx were not to be trifled with. They had no interest in diplomacy, no interest in understanding humanity. It was clear from their words that they saw the crew of the Horizon as an intrusion, an unwelcome presence in their ancient domain. Morgan felt a bead of sweat form at his temple. The situation had gone from strange to dangerous in the blink of an eye. He knew they had to get back to the Horizon. Fast. But the question was, could they even make it back? Was the ship still under their control, or was the Onyx already manipulating it from within the station? "We need to leave," Morgan said, his voice sharp and decisive. "Back to the Horizon. We don't know what we're dealing with here, but it's clear they don't want us here." But just as the captain was about to order the crew to retreat, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The hum grew deafening, and the walls of the chamber seemed to shift. Panels slid open in the walls, revealing hidden doors and pathways. The entire station was coming to life. The Onyx were not content with simply scaring them off. They were going to force them to leave. "Captain," Carter shouted, panic rising in his voice. "The stations, it's locking us in. We can't get back to the ship. The doors are sealed." A cold realization hit Morgan like a punch to the gut. The Onyx weren't just keeping them here, they were trapping them. "Brace yourselves," Morgan ordered, drawing his weapon. "We may not be able to leave the same way we came in, but we're not staying here. We'll find another way." But as the crew began to move toward the nearest exit, the lights flickered again. This time, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching toward them. The air around them grew heavier, as though it were thick with pressure. And then they saw it. Figures, tall and shadowed, emerging from the darkness. The Onyx were here, but they weren't alone. The shadowy figures stood perfectly still, their glowing eyes fixed on the humans with unsettling calm. It was unclear whether these were the Onyx themselves or something else, but there was no mistaking the danger they posed. Their bodies were a dark, featureless mass of shadows, their outlines flickering as though they weren't entirely real. "You are in the presence of the Onyx." The voice from within their minds came again, this time more forceful, more commanding. "You will not leave until you have proven your worth." Morgan's heart raced. They were being tested. But what was the test? And how would they survive it? The crew was trapped. Their only option was to face whatever the Onyx had in store for them. They had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. They weren't leaving without a fight. The Onyx had spoken, and the test had begun. The crew of the Horizon stood frozen in the shadow of the Onyx. The strange, ghostly figures now filled the room, their dark forms towering above the crew. The glowing eyes that stared back at them seemed to see through every layer of their beings, piercing into their very souls. The air was thick with tension, almost suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. "Stay calm," Captain Morgan ordered, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. "We don't know what they want yet. Don't make any sudden moves." But the crew couldn't help it. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to flee from the oppressive force that surrounded them. However, their escape routes were sealed, and the station seemed to have a mind of its own, like it was manipulating their every move. The Onyx remained motionless, their eyes never leaving the crew, their silent presence pressing in on them from all sides. Then, after what felt like an eternity, one of the shadowy figures took a step forward. The others remained still, but this one moved with purpose, as though it were the leader, the one who spoke for the rest. "You are intruders," the voice came again, but this time it was more direct, more forceful. The voice filled their minds like a deep rumble, vibrating through their very bones. "The Onyx do not tolerate trespassers. You have entered our domain without permission. You must prove that you are worthy to leave." The words felt like a slap to their faces. The notion of proving worth, what could it possibly mean? The Onyx had already demonstrated their power by trapping them here, manipulating the ship, and now their words weighed heavily on the crew's hearts. "We don't want trouble," Morgan said, trying to maintain control. His mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but everything felt uncertain. "We're explorers. We were following a signal. We didn't know." Silence, human. The figure's eyes flashed, its voice cutting through Morgan's words like a blade. The room seemed to darken in response, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on them. "You have trespassed on sacred ground." Morgan felt the weight of those words. He had been in difficult situations before, but this was different. The Onyx didn't seem to care about explanations or diplomacy. They didn't want excuses. They wanted compliance. Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake. It wasn't the tremors from earlier. It was a deliberate movement, a force pulling them toward the center of the chamber. The crew struggled to stay on their feet as the floor seemed to bend underfoot, the walls pressing inward. "We have no choice," Dr. Harris whispered under his breath, his voice filled with dread. "We're being forced into their trial." Carter, who had been staring in disbelief at the Onyx figures, turned to Morgan. "What do we do? How do we prove our worth?" Morgan's mind raced, his eyes darting around the room, trying to find any clue that could give them an advantage. He wanted to believe that they could somehow talk their way out of this, but it was clear from the Onyx's reaction that they weren't interested in dialogue. The figure in front of them stepped closer, its form rippling like a shadow caught in the wind. "The trial begins now." Before Morgan could react, the room seemed to change. The air grew thick, charged with an eerie energy, and the floor beneath them began to glow with the same strange symbols that covered the station. The symbols pulsed, their lights flashing in rapid succession, creating an unsettling pattern. It was as if the very walls were alive, shifting and changing with the Onyx at will. The Onyx leader raised a hand, and in that instant, the symbols on the walls illuminated brighter than ever before, blinding them for a moment. When the light faded, they were no longer in the chamber they had entered. The crew stood in a completely different environment, an alien arena that felt as though it had been pulled from the depths of their nightmares. It was an arena that seemed to stretch for miles. The sky above was dark, with swirling purple clouds that looked alive, writhing like some cosmic force. The ground beneath them was blackened, cracked, and scorched. Strange structures stood in the distance, monuments to forgotten civilizations. The whole place felt hostile, like they were standing on a battlefield, with no clear way out. "We are not in the station anymore," Carter said, his voice tense. "We've been transported." "Yes," the Onyx leader's voice boomed in their minds again. "You are now part of the trial. The rules are simple." The symbols on the ground flared, outlining strange, glowing lines in the dirt. As the crew looked around, they saw several creatures, monstrous and twisted, begin to emerge from the shadows. They were unlike anything the crew had ever seen. Some had multiple limbs, others seemed to be made of pure shadow, their bodies rippling and shifting in unnatural ways. Their eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the Onyx, and their movements were jerky, as if they were constructs rather than living beings. "You will fight," the voice commanded. "Prove your strength. Survive, and you will be allowed to leave. Fail, and you will remain here forever." The crew exchanged terrified looks. They were being forced into combat, fighting for their lives against these nightmarish creatures. There was no way around it. The Onyx weren't offering any alternative. "We have no choice," Morgan said, his voice calm despite the storm of fear raging inside him. "Stay together. Focus on staying alive. We'll figure out a way to escape." He drew his weapon, and the rest of the crew did the same, preparing for the inevitable fight. As they took their positions, the monstrous creatures moved in. They seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for a signal. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook again, and the creatures charged. The crew opened fire, their weapons sending bursts of energy into the darkness. The creatures recoiled, but there were so many, and they were relentless. The Onyx didn't care how they fought. They just wanted to see if they could survive. But the creatures were unlike anything they'd faced before, moving with terrifying speed, dodging their shots as though they could read their every move. Morgan fired his weapon, taking down one of the creatures, but it seemed to regenerate almost immediately, its form shifting into a new shape. They were dealing with enemies that didn't follow the rules of nature. "Stay focused," Morgan shouted as he ducked behind a large structure, narrowly avoiding a strike from one of the creature's long, jagged claws. "We need to find a way to break their pattern." But no matter what they did, the creatures kept coming, their attacks becoming more aggressive. The crew was being pushed to their limits, every instinct screaming at them to run, to escape. But that wasn't an option. The Onyx had made it clear the trial had begun, and it would end only when they had proven their worth. And Morgan knew one thing for certain: if they failed here, they would never leave this place. The Onyx would keep them trapped forever. As the battle raged on, Morgan realized that the true nature of the trial was far more than survival. It was a test of strength, resilience, and determination. Only those who could endure would earn the right to leave. But would they survive long enough to prove their worth? The fight had only just begun.